In the mid-1980s, Ethiopia faced one of the darkest periods in its long history. While much of the world was moving into an era of new technology, music, and economic expansion, Ethiopia was descending into a nightmare. The famine that ravaged the country between 1983 and 1985 was not simply the result of drought. It was a catastrophe shaped by politics, war, corruption, and global neglect. To truly understand this forgotten famine, we must step into the conditions that created it, the unimaginable suffering it caused, and the legacy it left behind. Ethiopia, one of the oldest nations in the world, entered the 1980s under the control of Mengistu Haile Mariam's Marxist-Leninist regime known as the Derg. Mengistu's government had seized power in the 1970s after the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie. It promised reform, equality, and progress. But what followed was fear, purges, and civil war. The regime's focus was on consolidating power, not supporting its people. Land reforms displaced millions. The government's policy of forced resettlement uprooted rural populations and sent them into unfamiliar arid lands where farming was nearly impossible. Instead of helping, these policies deepened vulnerability. On top of this, armed conflict consumed huge resources. Ethiopia's government poured money into weapons, even as the rural poor struggled to survive. Nature made things worse. A severe drought struck the northern regions, drying up crops and wiping out livestock. For peasant farmers, who depended on the land for survival, this meant devastation. But drought alone could not have caused famine on such a scale. It was political choices, the confiscation of harvests, the restrictions on movement, and the denial of aid that turned hardship into catastrophe. By 1983, reports from Ethiopia painted a grim picture. Villages emptied as families abandoned their homes in search of food. Parents carried children for days across barren landscapes, hoping to find relief camps. Some never made it. Others arrived only to face overflowing camps with too little food to go around. The numbers are staggering. Estimates suggest that between 400,000 and 1 million people perished. But numbers alone cannot capture the tragedy. Behind every figure was a human being, a farmer who watched his fields turn to dust, a mother forced to choose which child might live, a young boy who walked for miles and collapsed just short of safety. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes of heartbreaking despair. A survivor named Almaz recalled, "We ate leaves from the trees. We dug in the soil for roots, but my children became weaker every day. One morning I woke and one of them was gone. I had nothing to give." Another survivor, Tesfaye, remembered how his family walked for weeks. "We carried my little sister, but she died on the road. We buried her under a tree and kept walking." Disease spread rapidly in the camps where malnutrition weakened bodies and made them easy prey for illness. Doctors Without Borders reported at the time that many children died not of hunger itself, but of preventable diseases that their frail bodies could no longer resist. For much of the famine, the world did not see. Ethiopia was isolated, its suffering hidden by geography, censorship, and indifference. International relief agencies struggled to gain access, often blocked by the government's suspicion of outsiders. But the silence could not last forever. In late 1984, a BBC news crew arrived and broadcast footage that stunned the globe. Michael Björk, the BBC correspondent, described the famine as the closest thing to hell on earth. His haunting words accompanied images of skeletal children with hollow eyes, mothers clutching lifeless babies, and long lines of starving people waiting for food that never came. These images cut through the noise of daily life in the West. Viewers could no longer ignore Ethiopia. The footage ignited outrage. Donations poured in. Governments pledged aid. But as one BBC producer later reflected, it should not have taken a television camera for the world to care. The most famous response came in 1985 with Live Aid. Organized by musician Bob Geldof, Live Aid was more than a concert. It was a global event. Held simultaneously in London and Philadelphia, and broadcast live to an audience of billions, it brought together the biggest names in music: Queen, U2, David Bowie, and many more. The message was simple: the world cannot stand by while millions starve. The concerts raised an unprecedented amount of money, tens of millions of dollars in a single day. For many, it felt like humanity at its best, uniting to save lives across continents. The event remains one of the largest humanitarian fundraisers in history. But the reality was complicated. While aid did reach many in need, large portions were intercepted by the Ethiopian government and used for military purposes. Reports later showed that relief was often diverted, manipulated, or delayed. This grim truth revealed the difficulty of delivering aid in a nation torn apart by war and ruled by a regime more concerned with power than its people. Still, Live Aid did succeed in one crucial way. It forced the famine into the global spotlight and proved that collective action could make a difference. It set a precedent for future humanitarian responses, showing the power of media and public opinion to drive change. The famine of the 1980s left scars that Ethiopia still carries. It devastated communities, wiped out generations of farmers, and deepened mistrust between citizens and their government. It also exposed the vulnerabilities of a nation at the mercy of both climate and politics. Globally, the famine forced difficult questions. How do we ensure aid is delivered effectively in regions of conflict? How do we prevent governments from weaponizing hunger? How do we balance urgency with accountability? These questions remain as relevant today as they were 40 years ago. A survivor named Kidan summed it up years later. The world remembers the concert, the music, the stars, but we remember the hunger. We remember those who never came back. Ethiopia has made progress since those dark years, but challenges persist. Climate change continues to bring droughts. Political instability still threatens stability. The memory of the famine is not just history, it is a warning. The Ethiopian famine was more than a humanitarian disaster. It was a test of human responsibility. It revealed the best of humanity, the compassion of millions who gave what they could. And it revealed the worst, the cruelty of leaders who allowed suffering to continue. Michael Buerken's words remain as haunting today as they were in 1984, the closest thing to hell on earth. For survivors, those words were not metaphor. They were their reality. To forget this story is to risk repeating it. Hunger remains one of the greatest threats to human life today. Around the world, millions still face food insecurity. The lesson of Ethiopia is clear. Famine is not only about the absence of food, it is about injustice, neglect, and the misuse of power. The famine of Ethiopia stands as a reminder that silence can kill, that inaction can be as deadly as drought. Remembering it honors those who were lost and challenges us to build a future where no child in Ethiopia or anywhere else is left to starve.